Hello, this is Chapter 1 Lecture Video Part 1. So, Chapter 1 title is The Nature of Addiction. So that's going to be the first part that we cover. The objectives for this chapter are to define what addiction means, introduce different models and perspectives to treating addiction, and to acknowledge substance misuse in society. So as we go through this chapter, I'm going to kind of pick out parts from your textbook that are important for you to note, as well as maybe share some personal insight from the years I've worked in addiction and through an outpatient program, and kind of give you some examples to hopefully help you better understand the material. So let's start kind of with that conversation of what is addiction. So we have this concept, and whether you've had experience or not had experience kind of decides whether or not what your views are on addiction. So in the very beginning of your textbook, they acknowledge addiction as this fatal attraction. And those words always stick out for me because when I was working in outpatient as a therapist, I had I had an intensive outpatient group as well as an outpatient group. And when I was working with this population, I should say, there was a bad batch of heroin going around at the time. And every day I would come into my groups and I would get started, and I kind of did like a daily check-in with them. And, of course, this came up in conversation, and I had clients even in that group on their way to being recovered tell me that that would be the bags that they would tend to go for. So I've kind of always physically seen that fatal attraction based off of working in the field itself. And I could never understand why. I didn't understand, well, why would you want that bad batch of heroin? I mean, it's killing everybody. It's killing your friends. It's killing your family. It's killing people. And the best example that I could get to help me try to rationalize this is I had clients tell me that they wanted that near-death experience. They wanted that high. So with that being said, that's where I truly can relate to seeing this fatal attraction in the field. So your book talks about it, and it may involve a person, an activity, or a substance. Again, that was just my connection with it, but I wanted to make sure that we covered or addressed that. So another thing to think about is the effects of addiction are everywhere, and they are also nowhere. So what is meant by that is that it is everywhere. I mean, addiction could strike anyone at any time. It doesn't just specifically target young people or old people or middle-aged people. It targets whoever and anyone. It could be in your backyard. It could not be in your backyard. It just depends. It also strikes nowhere. With that being said, is that a lot of people who are in addiction tend to try to keep it private and keep it, under wraps because they don't want everyone to know that they're using or they're in addiction. So that's kind of where we get that everywhere and nowhere thing. And I want you to take a moment to kind of think about in your own life if you have been affected by addiction, whether it's yourself personally, a family member, a friend, where you've heard of addiction or where you've seen addiction, and kind of just think about that for a moment as you kind of go through this chapter and we talk about different examples, and keep that in mind for you. There will also be a discussion question for this module in relation to what your thoughts and opinions are on addiction. So kind of keep that in mind as we move forward. So we've kind of got this entry-level understanding of what addiction is. So now let's move on and let's talk about definitions of addiction. Your book provides 4 of them that we're going to go over. So the first one I wanted to review was the Dictionary of World Origins. This defines addiction as having given over or awarded to someone or being attached to a person or cause. It's the roots of the word addiction are in the Latin past participles addictus. I may have mispronounced that, but the second definition comes from the substance abuse literature, and addiction is variously defined as a moral and spiritual condition, poverty of the spirit, a sense of helplessness, excessive appetite, a bad habit, the search for emotional satisfaction, a stigmatizing label, a disorder of choice, a chronic relapsing brain disease, and a fundamental problem of motivation. So there's kind of a lot of different definitions just within that one definition. Lots lots of things that I could argue with that definition, but I'm going to leave it at that for now because this does kind of relate to our discussion question. So I don't want to give you too much of my insight yet into that. The DSM-5 also provides a definition, and I'm just reviewing my notes here for you. It has a new chapter on substance-related and addictive disorders. It categorizes a variety of substance use disorders separate with criteria that provide a graduation of severity within each diagnostic category. Previous editions of the DSM identify two separate categories of substance use disorder, which was substance abuse and substance dependence, which they're trying to stay away from the abuse of the dependence terms. So kind of important to note on that. So their primary thing was changing the word verbiage, if you will, with that. The Social Work Dictionary also provides a definition for us, and I'm going to read that to you. Addiction is a physiological and psychological dependence on a behavior or substance. Behavioral addictions, such as sex, gambling, spending, obsessive internet use, and consumptive addictions, such as alcohol, drugs, or food, often have similar etiologies, prognosis, and treatment procedures. So, some thought there as far as even just in defining addiction, there is not one definition for addiction. So when we're working with addiction, it's important to think about that if we can't even define it with one definition, then we can't just have one specific way to work with people with addiction. So keep that in mind as we go through some of these other chapters. Another thing I wanted to bring up for topic's sake is labels. I hate labels. I can't stand labeling anything. What I mean by that is even when I worked in drug and alcohol, I would never call anyone an addict. I feel that if I label somebody an addict, then I'm putting this label based off of my own perceptions and thoughts on this person. And, then that's something that they have to live by. They're living by this label, quote unquote. So there's junkies, there's addicts, crackheads, crazy, what are all of those things besides labels? And if you think about it, if somebody were to call you one of those labels, think about how you would feel, or what would it do to your emotional status? Or if you're going out and you're trying to do things and you kind of have this thought in the back of the head, well, I'm nothing but a junkie. So it kind of inhibits us from being a better person when we add these labels into things. So labeling and diagnosing is incompatible with the strengths perspective. The strengths perspective, as we will kind of talk about as throughout this entire book, is focusing on the positives. So we want to kind of instill that positive into people. So if we are doing that, labels don't really work with that. Although, keep in mind, we do have to diagnose people or else we wouldn't really be able to bill for our services as far as treatment goes. So labeling and diagnosing have to be two different things, but, it comes down to, again, that verbiage or how you're talking to someone or how you're working with someone. So another thing that your book covers in this first part of this chapter is kind of like one of the biggest debates in the drug and alcohol world. Although the tendency is to equate addiction with loss of control, the extent to which the individual is truly beyond self-control cannot be proven, but can be inferred only from external behavior or from an individual's self-reporting of this phenomenon. To what extent addiction is an involuntary disease is an open question. I know at some point, or maybe even looking through your syllabus or different things like that, you've probably heard of addiction being referred to as a disease concept. So there is going to be several times throughout this course that we are going to reference this and kind of talk about that big debate. In society today, some people view addiction as a disease concept. Some people view addiction as a choice. I know referring back to one of the definitions that we had before was saying that it's I believe it was referred to as a disease of choice, a disorder of choice, I'm sorry. So with that being said is, you are entitled to have your own thoughts or your own beliefs on that. And we're going to provide different reasonings for why some people do believe it is a disease or why some people may believe that it is not a disease. But this is kind of the start of where this whole topic of conversation comes up in our textbooks. I wanted to point that out. Going a little bit further into that, so the authors talk about this disease concept and who gets to define whether a person loses control. Is it the person themselves, or is it somebody else that kind of defines when a person has lost control or when that disorder has actually become a disease for them? So, adding more questions to that is, does a person get to decide whether they continue with their addiction or whether they stop their addiction? That's another thing to think about is, have they officially lost control? Is it to a point where a person is using so much that if they don't continue to use, that they're going to get sick? Is that considered a point of losing control? Is that for that person to decide? Is it for the drug dealer to decide? Or is it for the friends or family to decide? Some thoughts with that. Does it depend on rock bottom that they hit? Is there changes in our brain? There is a whole chapter where we talk about how drugs impact our brains and a different chemistry. It affects the brain chemistry that, does it mess things up to the point where you can't think straight anymore? So we're going to talk more about that as well. The textbook also talks about defining disease as a pathological condition of a part, organ, or system of an organism resulting from various causes such as infections or genetic defect. There's also the concept, is it an illness or a disease, which makes it less judgmental. Illness or disease? Would you rather have an illness or would you rather have a disease? Again, going back to that labeling thing and how it can be a dangerous thing. A personal belief that I have is that it starts off as a choice, but then at some point, it no longer becomes a choice. I mean, you may choose to take that first sip of alcohol with friends or family or something like that, but when does it get to a point where it's not just a sip anymore. It's not just one drink or 3 drinks. It becomes a whole case of beer, or it becomes 2 bottles of wine. When does it become too much? I feel that at some point you're no longer in control of that. You're drinking to the point where you are not going to be sick anymore, or you're using to the point where you're not going to be sick anymore. You may have chose to try it the first time, but then at some point, because of that repetitive behavior over and over and over again, you're no longer choosing to do it, and your body has become dependent on it. That's kind of like my own personal thoughts or beliefs onto that. In the field, a lot of times in treatment itself, they constantly want to refer to it as that disease concept, maybe like that medical model kind of thing, because there's a lot of factual proof behind stuff like that. And I think it makes it easier for people who don't have a good understanding of addiction to better understand it by saying, okay, well, we're labeling this as a disease. This is the medical concept. There's facts behind that, different things like that. So, that's one way to view it, but, there's so much to that bigger picture. You have your environmental factors, you have your family factors, you have genetic factors, you have, personality factors, different things into that can contribute it to becoming an addiction. Another thing that we'll kind of reference a few times too is this biopsychosocial spiritual model. So we have the biology, psychology, social, spiritual model aspects of that. So breaking that down for the authors is bio being that addiction is a complex brain disease. The brain is predisposed genetically to specific kinds of addictions in specific people. Cravings, you may have heard of cravings, like people actually crave these drugs or this alcohol that they are using. A craving can be a physiological aspect of it. We mentioned that we're going to talk more about how drugs affect our brains. So there's changes in the wiring of our brains, physical changes to your body as well, and genetic factors. I touched upon that for a second too. Psycho being like the mind, the thinking aspect of that, the irrational thought process. So in your mind, you can come up with these thoughts and totally believe them to be real, but really it's the furthest thing from reality itself. So when you're working with somebody like that, you have to break down that thought process to kind of change it. Cravings can be in the brain be in the brain and not just in the body as well. You may have that physical craving because you don't want to be sick, but you also have that mental craving too. I need this to not be sad anymore. I need this to not be angry. I need this to be happy or to feel emotions in my life. Very distorted thoughts come with using addiction. Social, who are you experiencing it with? Where did you first experience it? There's that environmental factors. Those all play into it. Spiritual, was there a spiritual aspect prior to using, or did you gain a spiritual aspect from using? Is there a sense of meaning or a sense of purpose, or maybe it's the lack thereof of your meaning or your purpose, and that's why you chose to use. Oftentimes you're going to see the spiritual side of things more so in recovery than in the actual act of addiction. Where you might be more likely to see it in active addiction might be kind of like when you see a person hit that rock bottom and they're kind of begging for it to stop or asking for, something to kind of give with that. That might be where you see some of that spiritual side of things, but it does come out more in recovery. Okay, so, what is the prevalence of substance misuse? So we're starting to understand we have addiction. We're understanding kind of how to break down this addiction. So where do we see the misuse? Like, where does it become a misusing issue? So mental health professionals expect that approximately 50% of their clients to have problems stemming from their own or from a family member's alcoholism. So maybe there was a family member that suffered from alcoholism. Well, now, little Johnny might have some struggles with alcoholism as well. Very interesting fact, over 80% of persons incarcerated in the United States have a substance use problem upon admission into prison. So, there's this strong connection or link between substance use and crimes. So it is very common. Or is this where we're seeing more of it because people aren't really forthcoming about their substance use addiction until they get caught for a crime or something like that? 40% of all hospital beds in the United States, except for maternity and ICU, are occupied by a patient whose ailment is related to alcohol consumption. So that's a lot of hospital beds that are being filled up by people who are using alcohol or other drugs. 71% of social workers have taken one or more actions with clients with substance use disorders in the past year. So here's our prevalence. There is substance misuse in the community. There is substance misuse in your community, our community. It's there. And, these are just some numbers. I'm sure that, these change. They might even be increasing more as we speak. The next area that I wanted to talk about or touch upon is things that we're seeing on the news or social media. So this also kind of creates our perception of what addiction is. So the headlines in the news, I did like a quick Google search whenever I was writing up my lecture notes for this chapter, and just some things that I had looked up. A few headlines here. Police keeping watch on the rise of methamphetamine in New Hampshire. Jails, prisons slowly loosen resistance to addiction meds. And will these new features help relieve your smartphone addiction? So I had to throw a different one in there. And it doesn't matter if you think addiction is not a disease. So we're having these different headlines that are kind of catching people's attention. And we're seeing them in the news and we're seeing them on social media. And, think about what your views are when you hear those headlines. Is that a positive thing that you're getting from it, or is it a negative thing that you're getting from it? Social media and news tend to focus on negative aspects of things. So we're getting like that negative view. For whatever reason, sex, drugs, lies, scandals sells. So we're seeing that, they're keeping an eye on addiction, but they're not really talking about how we're preventing the problem. We're just talking about it after the fact. Celebrities. How many times have we heard of a celebrity overdosing? I mean, Lindsay Lohan, I think, did 6 times in rehab. Philip Seymour Hoffman found dead from a heroin overdose. We got Prince's death. Demi Lovato, I think, was one of our more recent ones that just suffered an overdose. So another thing that I like to talk about, or I like to think about, have you guys think about, is celebrities are also falling into addiction as well. It's not just you and I. It's not just your everyday people. It is celebrities who have all the money and all the fame and glory in the world, and they can still fall into the struggles with addiction. Does it make their addiction different than our addiction? You could debate that, or you could have insight onto that. I think that with celebrities, they have more money, so they might be able to go to different types of treatment programs, but I don't think that it makes their addiction any different than ours. And I don't even think that that's a good argument either, because even in the community now, if you don't have health insurance or you don't have money, there's ways to get funding for your treatment. So I don't think money really talks in a situation like this, other than, the dangers of having so much money so you have an endless supply of drugs. But something to talk about or debate about would be celebrities and addiction. Kind of brought this up earlier, but I'm going to touch upon it again here, is that strengths perspective. So when we talk about the strengths perspective, it isn't a theory, but it is a way to help people with struggles. So instead of us focusing on the problem, we're focusing on a person's strengths. So if you were to come to me and tell me that you had a problem, and if I wanted to help you or work with you in a certain way, I would try to find your strengths. I would try to work with you to find what is a positive in your situation, or what is something that is a strength of yours that can help us to move you from the problem and work more closer towards a solution. So that's kind of where we get this strengths perspective. So it's not a theory per se, but it's a way of working with someone. It's very useful in the addictions field because, let's face it, we just talked about the news and the social media. We have such this negative focus on addiction, and if I have nothing that I'm excited for, nothing that I'm looking forward to, then what is it going to take for me to get better or to be able to overcome that addiction? So I would need someone that's going to help me focus on my strengths or help me focus on something positive rather than something negative, because I'm not going to be inclined to be motivated to work towards something. Some other themes in recovery. A major national study reports that most recovery is natural recovery. People recover on their own without help. Yeah, I could agree to disagree with the authors on this one. We tend to study those that are in treatment because those are the people that we have access to. Can somebody recover on their own? Absolutely. I'm sure it happens all the time, but I feel that it could be dangerous in some aspects. I mean, if you have a person that is addicted to alcohol and, they're having tremors or seizures or different things, you're not going to want to try to handle that one on your own or, try to recover from that. But maybe I would agree that natural recovery is possible for somebody that maybe isn't that far into their addiction where they're that physically dependent on it, and they can recover on their own. About 3/4 of people who meet the criteria for addiction do not receive treatment and recover on their own, according to your textbook. Managing the symptoms of the disorder rather than trying to stop being an alcoholic or an addict. You're viewing yourself as managing the symptoms of the problem rather than being the problem itself. When you're in addiction, you don't want to be the problem. You want to just work on the steps of the problem. Some other themes that I wanted to kind of point out for you would be choice. So you have to want to choose to get better, choose to be in recovery, need for personal control. You need to find what way works best for you to get to your sobriety or to get to your recovery. Hope. If you instill hope in somebody, they have something to look forward to. They have something to work towards. We can do this together. Strengths-based, all day long with that one. A sense of purpose, finding a reason or a purpose for their situation or struggle. Everything happens for a reason. When I would work with people who would come to me and they were, really down and out on their luck, we would kind of think about, okay, so A, B, and C happened to you, but what can we make out of that situation? Maybe there was a lesson to be learned. Maybe there was a reason why this person is no longer in your life, or maybe there's a reason why you ended up in this room today to kind of work towards something better. Maybe there's a reason why you got caught and you got put in jail so that you would end up going to treatment to get better for your recovery. Everything happens for a reason. Another thing I want to point out is 12-step programs tend to fulfill this. So we will talk more about the 12-step programs, but that's kind of where you get that sense of purpose, that spirituality. That thing I was telling you about is more focused in recovery than an active addiction. Another thing or theme would be a sense of achievement, the counterpart to the feelings of grief and loss that happen early on in recovery. I have to stop using forever sounds like a life-threatening thing to an addicted person early on in treatment. I noticed that if I would tell clients when they first came to me, okay, well, we're going to help you never use again. Never use again. Think about that. That makes it sound permanent forever. And to someone who's just starting this, they're thinking, oh my God, I can't imagine my life never using again. So you want to start in baby steps. Like, okay, well, I'm not going to use today. I'm not going to use for the next hour. Never is a big, bold word. So if you work with that sense of achievement, set up little goals for them, they'll be more likely to kind of stick with it or stay with it. And the presence of at least one key person. So if I'm going to work on being in recovery, I need a support system. If I have somebody that's going to be there for me and help me, then I'm more likely to kind of keep moving forward on things. So that's where that one key person in your life, whether it be a friend, a professional, a teacher, a family member, a spiritual leader, whoever, you just need someone that is supportive. Some don't have help or have support, so they rely solely on treatment itself, whether it's the group or it's their therapist. They may have burned all of their bridges. So that's something to kind of think about when you're working with someone in recovery. There's some common themes that kind of help a person move from, okay, I have this addiction, I have this big thing, this big problem, if you will, to starting to find a solution or starting to work towards recovery. So we're going to stop there for the first part of this lecture video. In Chapter 1, Lecture Video Part 2, we'll pick up, it's about approximately page 27 in your textbook. So we'll kind of pick up there and we'll start finishing up this discussion about what is addiction and help you prepare for the next chapter. So thank you.